The house my cousin Julia moved into in the winter of 2018 was old, two-story, and tucked into the edge of a quiet wooded neighborhood on the outskirts of Albany, New York. It had been empty for nearly 6 years before she bought it. The previous owner, a reclusive older man named Frederick Turner, had passed away in the house. No one found him until weeks later when neighbors reported the smell. When Julia told me this, she laughed nervously, saying the real estate agent practically whispered it, as if it was a sin to speak the truth too loud. Julia got the house at a steal, and since she was newly divorced and trying to start over with her 7-year-old son, Elias, she didn't ask too many questions. She said the house needed work, but felt warm, and that Elias liked his room upstairs because of the big window that looked out toward the woods. I was skeptical, but I didn't say much. Everyone needs a fresh start sometimes, even if it's in a house with a dark past. The first few weeks passed without incident. Julia and I talked on the phone often. She told me about repainting the kitchen, fixing the plumbing, and buying new curtains. Elias started school and made a friend down the street. Everything seemed normal. But sometime around mid-January, her tone changed. She didn't say anything outright, but I noticed hesitation in her voice, as if she were trying to convince herself everything was okay. Then one night she called me in a panic. It was close to midnight when the phone rang. I remember because I was still awake, scrolling through old photos. Her voice was shaking. "Can you come here?" she said. "Please. I can't be here tonight." I drove the 2.5 hours from my place in Connecticut to hers without thinking. When I arrived around 2:30 a.m., Julia was waiting on the front steps with Elias asleep in her arms. She looked pale, like she hadn't slept in days. Her eyes kept darting to the second-story windows. She didn't speak until we were inside and the doors were locked. "I don't know if I'm going crazy," she whispered, "but there's something in this house." I stayed with them that night. Elias slept in Julia's bed, curled against her, while I took the guest room. The house was quiet, aside from the normal creaks you'd expect in an old place. But sometime after 4 a.m., I heard footsteps upstairs. At first I thought it was Elias going to the bathroom, but the steps were heavy, deliberate. They moved slowly from one end of the hallway to the other, then stopped just outside my door. I held my breath. There was no knock, just silence. Then the steps started again, retreating back down the hall. In the morning, Julia made coffee with shaking hands. I didn't want to alarm her, but I told her I'd heard something in the night. She nodded, eyes wide. "Every night," she said, "around the same time. I hear walking. I've checked a dozen times. There's never anything there." She told me it started about 2 weeks ago. First, 2 weeks ago. First the footsteps, then doors opening and closing on their own. Elias began having night terrors, screaming in his sleep, kicking, crying, but never remembering anything in the morning. Julia would wake up to find all the lights on or the back door wide open. Once she found every cabinet in the kitchen standing open like someone had searched them in a frenzy. I stayed with them for 3 more nights. Each night, the footsteps returned, and each time, they got bolder. On the 3rd night, I heard something scrape across the floor upstairs, like furniture being dragged. In the morning, Julia's dresser was moved 3 feet from the wall. I couldn't explain it. We installed motion detection cameras inside the house. We placed one in the hallway upstairs, one in the living room, and another in Elias's room. That night, we all stayed in the living room downstairs, sleeping on couches and makeshift beds. Around 4:12 a.m., the hallway camera triggered. We watched the footage the next morning. At first, there was nothing, just the quiet hallway. Then, slowly, the shadow of a figure appeared, tall, indistinct, and wavering like smoke. It moved from left to right, stopping in front of the camera for only a second. There was no face, no features, just blackness. Then it faded like it had never been there. Julia began crying. I didn't know what to say. I tried to rationalize it, glitch in the camera, maybe something casting a shadow, but in my gut, I knew better. The next day, Elias told us he didn't want to sleep in his room anymore. He said the man in the hallway kept looking at him at night. When Julia pressed him for details, he simply said, "He doesn't blink." I convinced Julia to leave the house for a few days. We went to my place, but she didn't sleep. She kept checking the baby monitor she insisted on bringing, even though Elias slept right beside her. I offered to go back to the house to get more of their things. She didn't want me to, but I told her I'd be fine. I left that afternoon. I got to the house around 5 p.m. It was eerily quiet. I grabbed clothes, some toys for Elias, and a few documents from the office. As I walked down the hall upstairs, I passed the open door of Elias's room. The temperature dropped. It was sudden and sharp, like walking into a freezer. I could see my breath. Then I heard a voice behind me, low, almost like a whisper and a growl at once. "Get out!" I turned, but no one was there. The air felt thick, heavy. My limbs tingled, like I was being watched. I grabbed what I could and ran out of the house, slamming the door behind me. I didn't tell Julia what happened. I didn't need to. She could see it in my face. She didn't go back. A few weeks later, she sold the house at a loss to a property management company. They planned to gut it, renovate, and flip it. But after starting renovations, the contractor called Julia. He wanted to know if anything weird had ever happened in the house. He said one of his crew had walked off the job after hearing someone whispering to him in the attic, though no one else was up there. Another guy quit after seeing something move across the living room wall like a shadow in daylight. They finished the renovations, but the house never sold. It sat empty for almost a year before being rented out to a young couple. 2 months later, they moved out without explanation. I drove by once, out of curiosity. It was just after sunset. The lights were off, and the house looked even darker than the forest behind it. I parked across the street and just watched. Nothing happened at first. Then, in the second-story window, the one to Elias's old room, I saw movement. The curtain lifted, as if by a hand, and I saw a figure looking out. It was still, unmoving, watching me. I blinked, and it was gone. I never went back. Julia and Elias live in a small apartment now. It's cramped, but safe. Every once in a while, she has a nightmare and calls me. She says she hears footsteps in the dream, always at the same time, always getting closer. Elias doesn't remember much about the house, but sometimes when he's tired or daydreaming, he hums a little tune. It's the same one I heard in the hallway once, just before the voice told me to get out. We never found out exactly what was in that house. Maybe it was the spirit of Frederick Turner. Maybe it was something older, something that clung to the walls long before he died. Whatever it was, it didn't want us there. And part of me thinks it's still waiting. Watching. Story the end. It started when I moved into a house on the outskirts of Winston-Salem, North Carolina. A quiet town, but old enough that every street and every cracked sidewalk seemed to carry stories. I had taken a job at a local high school teaching American history, and the house was a small 2-bedroom colonial built sometime in the 1940s. It wasn't perfect. Creaky floors, narrow hallways, and a damp crawl space, but the price was too good to pass up. The previous owner had died a year before, and his adult children just wanted to sell it fast. That alone should have been enough of a red flag, but I convinced myself I was just being paranoid. The first month was uneventful. Mostly me working late hours, returning to the empty house, eating quick dinners, and grading papers. It was only when the seasons began to shift from summer to fall that I noticed small things that didn't quite make sense. Nothing dramatic at first. A window that I knew I had closed would be open. The basement light would be on, even though I hadn't gone down there. A glass I left in the sink would be on the counter the next day. I told myself I was just tired, that I wasn't paying attention. That's what you do when you don't want to believe something is wrong. You rationalize. Then I started hearing the footsteps. They always came at night. I'd be in bed, half asleep, and I'd hear them. Slow, deliberate steps across the hardwood floor in the hallway just outside my door. The first time it happened, I thought maybe I'd forgotten to lock the front door. I grabbed the baseball bat from under my bed and crept out, heart thudding against my ribs like it was trying to break out of my chest. I checked every room. Nothing. All the windows and doors were locked. I convinced myself it was the house settling, but deep down I knew better. There's something unmistakable about the sound of footsteps, not creaking, not popping, steps. It escalated. One night, I woke up to find my bedroom door wide open. I always closed it before going to bed. I sat up, disoriented and alert, waiting to hear something. Anything. The silence was louder than the footsteps. I got up and checked the house again. Nothing. But I couldn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling until dawn. A week later, I woke up to the feeling of someone sitting on the edge of my bed. I didn't open my eyes immediately. I froze, thinking maybe it was sleep paralysis, maybe it was just a vivid dream. But then I felt the mattress sink. I opened my eyes and saw the shape of a figure, dark and unmoving, right at the foot of the bed. No features, just a dense shadow. I screamed and reached for the lamp, and by the time the light came on, the room was empty. The bed was flat, but I knew what I had felt. That was the night I started sleeping with the light on. I talked to a colleague at work, a woman named Denise, who had lived in the town her whole life. She listened to me carefully, and when I finished, she didn't laugh. She didn't roll her eyes or tell me it was all in my head. She said, "I don't want to scare you, but you should talk to someone who knows about the area." That's how I ended up at the Winston-Salem Historical Society. I spoke with an older man named Gerald who spent his time collecting property records and obituaries. When I gave him my address, he frowned. "That house has a history," he said. In the 1970s, a woman named Elizabeth Marin lived there. She was a nurse, lived alone. One night she was found dead in her bathtub, empty wine bottle, wrists slit. They ruled it suicide, but people said she'd been acting strange before she died. Talking to herself, saying someone was watching her. I asked if there were other deaths associated with the house. He hesitated, then pulled out a worn folder and flipped through pages. 2 more. A teenager in 1989 hung himself in the basement. His parents said he'd been complaining about voices. And in 2003, a man named Arthur Wells died in the upstairs bedroom. Heart attack, they said, but he was only 45 and healthy. The timeline chilled me. Roughly every 15 years, someone died in that house under mysterious circumstances. It was 2025. I left the Historical Society shaking, clutching that folder like it might protect me. When I got home, everything in the house felt different, like the walls had absorbed my fear. The air was heavy, still. That night, I heard whispering. It wasn't clear at first, more like the wind brushing against my ears. But the more I listened, the clearer it became. A man's voice, repeating something over and over. I couldn't understand the words, but the tone was pleading, almost desperate. I stood in the hallway trying to pinpoint the sound, and it led me straight to the basement door. I hadn't opened that door in weeks. Something about the basement always made my stomach tighten. I told myself it was because it was dark and unfinished, but I knew there was more to it. I grabbed a flashlight and opened the door. The smell hit me immediately. Damp, moldy, with something underneath it, something metallic. The flashlight flickered as I stepped down the stairs. Each step creaked under my weight. I reached the bottom and swept the light across the cement walls. Then I saw it. Scratches. Long, jagged marks running down the concrete like someone had clawed at it. Some were faint. Others looked fresh. I turned to go back up when I heard a loud bang from behind me. I spun around. The flashlight flickered again, then died. Pitch black. I reached for my phone, but it slipped out of my hand and clattered somewhere in the dark. I crouched, patting the floor frantically when I felt something brush against my leg. Not a mouse, not a draft. A hand. I bolted up the stairs, slammed the door shut, and locked it. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the living room with every light on, clutching the bat like it could save me from whatever lived beneath me. Over the next few days, things spiraled. I'd come home to find drawers open, my belongings rearranged, mirrors fogged with words written in streaks like breath. The word listen appeared more than once. I tried recording audio while I slept. The first night, nothing. The second night, at exactly 3:17 a.m., the recorder picked up what sounded like heavy breathing, then a voice. "Why won't you listen?" I moved out the next day. I packed everything I could in my car and left. I didn't care about breaking my lease. I just wanted to survive. I stayed with a friend for a while and eventually found a new apartment across town. But even after I left, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me. I kept hearing faint whispers. Sometimes I'd see shadows move out of the corner of my eye. One night I dreamed about Elizabeth Marin. She was standing in front of my old house, her eyes completely black. She opened her mouth and a chorus of voices came out. Men, women, children, all saying the same thing. He never left. I went back to Gerald at the Historical Society and asked if anyone had lived in the house after Arthur Wells. He shook his head. No one stayed more than a few months. It's been empty for a while. People say it's cursed. I asked who built the house in the first place. He pulled out an old map and pointed to the plot. Originally, it was part of the Baker family estate. They ran a funeral home here back in the early 1900s. There was a cemetery behind it, but it got moved when the town expanded. I asked, moved? He nodded. They relocated the headstones, but the bodies were never exhumed. I don't know what's worse, that something in that house was tied to the land or that it was never just a house at all. Whatever it was, I believe it was never meant to let anyone go. And I believe some part of it still lingers, waiting for the next tenant, maybe even attached to the people who leave. I still hear whispers on some nights, still wake up to the feeling of someone watching me. I've moved twice since then, changed my phone number, even tried therapy, but nothing helps. Once you've heard them, once you've felt them, you don't forget. You just wait for the next time they come back. Story the end. It was late November when I moved into the small studio apartment in an aging 3-story building nestled between 2 liquor stores on the edge of town. The rent was cheap, probably because of how run down it looked from the outside. Peeling paint, sagging window frames, and a saggy porch roof supported by warped wooden columns. But I didn't care. I had just broken up with my girlfriend, lost my job 2 months prior, and needed somewhere cheap and quiet to put myself back together. The apartment was number 3B, top floor, back corner. The landlord, a balding man with liver spots and a permanent cigarette tucked behind one ear, warned me that the building had been empty for a few months. Something about water damage from a busted pipe. He didn't say much more, just handed me the keys and grunted. The first night was uneventful, except for the creaking floors and the occasional bang from the radiators. I chalked it up to old building sounds. I didn't unpack much, just rolled out a mattress on the floor and plugged in a small lamp. I planned to get the rest of my stuff out of storage the following week. It was the third night that things started to shift. I was sitting cross-legged on the floor, scrolling through job listings on my laptop when I heard a soft thud from the far corner of the apartment, near the closet. It wasn't a loud noise. It sounded more like something small dropping or shifting. I glanced up. Nothing. I stood, walked over, opened the closet door, and checked. A couple wire hangers, a folded towel on the shelf, and some dust. That was it. I shrugged and went back to the laptop, but it happened again, this time louder. A definite thud. I whipped my head toward the closet. The door was ajar. I had definitely closed it. I got up slowly and walked over again. This time I pulled the string for the closet light. Nothing. The bulb was dead. Still, there was nothing inside. I told myself it was just my nerves. New place, unfamiliar sounds. I shut the door harder and went to bed early. That night, I dreamed about the closet. I was standing in the room, and the door was shaking violently, like someone inside was pounding on it, desperate to get out. I couldn't move, couldn't look away. Then the door burst open, and there was a figure, too dark to see clearly, crawling on all fours toward me. Its head tilted unnaturally, dragging against the floor as it crept forward with jerky, twitching movements. I woke up gasping, heart pounding. I looked at the clock. 3:17 a.m. I turned on the lamp. The closet door was open. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. The next morning, I decided to take a break and spend the day at a coffee shop with my laptop. The apartment felt wrong. Not just creepy, but heavy, like the air was thick, hard to breathe. I tried to rationalize it, stress, isolation, anxiety. But something deeper was gnawing at me. When I got back around sunset, I noticed something odd. The bulb in the closet, dead the night before, was on. Bright white light leaking out from the cracked open door. I had not replaced the bulb. I walked over slowly and opened the door. The light clicked off instantly. I froze. I slammed the door and dragged a chair in front of it. That night, I slept with the lights on. Nothing happened. But the following night, I heard it again. The thud, followed by the faint sound of breathing. Not mine. Not through the wall, but from inside the room, from the closet area. I held my breath and listened. It stopped. Then I heard the faintest giggle. A whisper, too soft to understand, like a child humming under their breath. The next day, I called the landlord. "Hey, has anything weird ever happened in this apartment?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He was quiet for a long moment. 3B? He said. Yeah. There's a reason it was empty. He didn't elaborate, said he was too busy to talk. hung up. So I started doing my own research. The local library had old newspaper archives. I spent hours digging and eventually found something. A fire in 1997. The building had partially burned, the top floor mostly. No deaths reported. But then I found an obscure follow-up article months later. Months later, a young woman named Claire who had lived in 3B went missing. Her body was never found. Her family claimed she had complained of hearing things in the walls and feeling watched. Police chalked it up to mental illness and stress from the fire. She was eventually declared dead in absentia. There was a grainy black and white photo in the article. I stared at it for a long time. Her eyes were wide, her smile forced. It was the kind of expression that looked normal until you stared too long. Then it started to feel wrong. I printed the article and taped it to the fridge. That night, I decided to record the room with my phone. Just audio. I hit record, placed it on the floor, and went to bed. In the morning, I listened back. There were the normal creaks, a few snoring sounds. Then, at exactly 2:41 a.m., I heard a faint clicking noise, like fingernails tapping on wood. It repeated rhythmically for over a minute. Then a voice, not clear, but female, whispering something like, "I know you're awake." My blood ran cold. I played that part over and over again. It was unmistakable. I emailed the clip to myself, then packed a bag. I wasn't staying another night. But when I got to the front door, the knob wouldn't turn. It wasn't locked. It just wouldn't budge, like it had rusted in place. I tried the back window, painted shut. I even called the fire department, pretending I was locked in. But when they arrived and tried the door, it opened instantly. The firefighter looked at me like I was nuts. I left that day, stayed at a motel, but part of me needed closure. I couldn't stop thinking about the girl in the article. So 2 days later, I went back during the afternoon just to grab the rest of my stuff. When I walked in, everything was exactly where I'd left it, except the article on the fridge. It was gone. In its place was a photo. Not printed, not glossy, just a small, faded Polaroid. It showed a woman curled up on the floor in front of the closet, her arms hugging her knees, her head tilted back in a silent scream. It was the same woman, Claire. I dropped the photo and backed out of the apartment. The hallway felt colder than the outside air. I turned to leave, but the hallway seemed longer, like it stretched further than it should. Each step I took echoed weirdly, like I was walking in an underground tunnel. And then I saw her, down the hall, near the stairwell, standing, still, her head slowly turning toward me. She was just a shadow, backlit by the frosted glass of the exit door, but I knew it was her. I could feel it. I bolted. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. I never went back. A month later, I moved across the state to stay with my cousin. I didn't tell him the details, just that I had a bad experience. One night, while unpacking, I found something at the bottom of my duffel bag. Another Polaroid. Not the same one. This one was taken from above, like from a ceiling corner. It showed me sleeping in my apartment, mouth open, facing the wall. And behind me, near the closet, a figure crouched low to the floor, too dark to see clearly, but I could tell it was her, and her face was just beginning to smile. Story the end. I remember the day I first moved into the house like it was yesterday, though it's been over a decade now. The house sat at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac in a neighborhood that looked peaceful, almost too perfect. I was fresh out of college and eager to start my first real job. The rent was affordable, the landlord seemed nice, and the place was exactly what I could afford at the time. An old, two-story house built sometime in the 1920s. The charm was in its creaky wooden floors and high ceilings, but something about the place always felt a little off. The first few nights were uneventful, just the usual settling noises you'd expect from an older home. But soon enough, I started noticing things. Small things at first, the faint sound of footsteps above me when I knew I was alone, the soft rustle of fabric or curtains in rooms I hadn't touched. I chalked it up to the house settling or my imagination running wild after long days at work. One evening, about 2 weeks in, I came home late. It was dark, and the house felt colder than usual. I switched on the lights, but there was a heaviness in the air, like the house was holding its breath. I poured myself a glass of water in the kitchen, and as I turned, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. A shadow moving swiftly across the living room wall. I whipped around, heart pounding, but there was nothing there. No one. The house was empty. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I was tired, after all. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard footsteps again. Slow, deliberate, pacing back and forth right above my bedroom ceiling. I live on the ground floor. There's an attic above, but it was always locked, and the landlord told me no one used it. I pulled the covers over my head and tried to drown out the sounds. Then, the next day, I asked the landlord about the attic. He looked uncomfortable, but said that decades ago, the attic had been sealed off because of safety concerns. He insisted no one had been up there in years. But the footsteps continued, always at night, always slow and measured. Sometimes I would hear faint whispering or murmurs, unintelligible but persistent. I tried recording it on my phone, but when I played it back, it was just static, nothing unusual. One night, I woke up abruptly to the sound of a woman crying, soft and mournful, coming from the hallway outside my bedroom. I sat up, eyes wide in the dark, heart hammering. The crying grew louder, but when I switched on the light and got up to check, the hall was empty. No sign of anyone. The crying stopped abruptly the moment I opened the door. After that, I started researching the history of the house. Digging through old newspapers and local archives, I discovered something chilling. The previous owner had been a woman named Margaret, who lived there alone in the 1940s. According to reports, Margaret's husband had died suddenly during World War II, and a few months later, Margaret herself was found dead in the house, an apparent suicide. Locals whispered that she had gone insane with grief and that her spirit never left the place. I didn't believe in ghosts, but the stories and the sounds in the house made me question everything. One night, I stayed up late, determined to catch whatever was haunting me. Around midnight, the temperature dropped sharply. My breath became visible in the air. Then, from the darkness, a faint figure began to materialize at the end of the hallway. A woman, pale and translucent, dressed in old-fashioned clothes. Her eyes were hollow, her mouth open in silent weeping. I was frozen in place. The figure drifted closer, and I could see the anguish on her face, the pain that consumed her. She stopped just short of my bedroom door and pointed a trembling finger at me. Suddenly, the room went icy cold, and I felt a crushing weight on my chest. I gasped, struggling for air. Then she vanished. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The following days were worse. Objects moved on their own, a chair overturned, a picture frame shattered, doors slammed shut without cause. My phone would ring, but no one would be on the other end. The whispers grew louder, now recognizable as pleas for help. I tried talking to the spirit. I said, "Margaret, what do you want? Why are you here?" The house answered with a sudden loud bang from the attic, followed by a chilling silence. I realized the attic must hold the key. I found the landlord's spare key and climbed the narrow stairs. The air was thick with dust and decay. At the far end, behind a heavy wooden door, I found a small trunk. Inside were old letters, photographs, and a diary belonging to Margaret. Reading the diary, I uncovered a horrific truth. Margaret hadn't been crazy or suicidal. Her husband's death had been no accident. He was murdered, poisoned by someone close to them, someone who wanted their land. Margaret had been trapped, afraid, and eventually locked away in the attic by this person. She died there, forgotten. The more I read, the heavier the air became. The attic door slammed shut behind me, and I felt the presence of someone else, darker, angry, and sinister. I barely escaped the attic, locking the door behind me. From that night on, the house changed. The sorrowful woman never appeared again, but I felt eyes watching me, malevolent and cold. I packed my things and left the house for good. Years later, I still dream about that night, the silent weeping, the attic door slamming, the weight on my chest. I sometimes wonder if Margaret found peace, or if the dark presence still waits in the shadows, ready to claim another soul. Some nights, when the wind howls just right, I swear I hear a faint whisper, "Help me." Story the end. The house was a modest 2-story Victorian, tucked into a quiet neighborhood on the edge of town, surrounded by overgrown maples and sycamores. When I first saw it, I was drawn to its old charm, the original woodwork, the high ceilings, the big bay windows. And truthfully, the price was too good to be true. It was one of those listings you stumble upon late at night, a property that seemed forgotten by time. I was freshly divorced, tired of the cramped apartment I'd been renting, and eager for a fresh start. The realtor assured me it had been empty for a while, but the previous owner had taken great care of it. I signed the papers on a humid September afternoon, the sun dipping low behind the trees. The house smelled of dust and wood polish, a strange mixture that hinted at decades of history trapped inside the walls. The neighbors were friendly, waving as I moved in, and the first few days were filled with the typical bustle of unpacking and settling. On the third night, I woke to a sound that didn't belong. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the sound was too rhythmic, deliberate. Footsteps, soft but unmistakably footsteps, coming from the hallway outside my bedroom. My heart skipped. I lay still, eyes wide, straining to listen. The steps stopped just outside the door. Then a faint knock. I froze. Rational thought kicked in. Maybe it was a neighbor's kid playing a prank. Maybe the old pipes were settling. I got up and checked the hall. Nothing. No one there. The door was locked. I told myself to sleep. But that was just the beginning. Over the next few nights, the footsteps returned. Sometimes pacing outside the bedroom, other times moving down the hall toward the stairs. The knocks, too, soft, measured, like a code I couldn't crack. I started leaving a small tape recorder running overnight. The first few nights, it captured only the faint hum of the air conditioner. But on the fourth night, I caught a whisper. It was barely audible, but the voice was female, distant, almost pleading, "Help me." I'm not superstitious, never have been. But the voice rattled me. I played the recording repeatedly, adjusting the volume, straining to hear more. Nothing else came through clearly, but that one word stuck with me. I started digging. The house had a history, all right. I found an article in the local paper Archives. A young woman named Lillian Harper had lived there in the early 1900s. She was a school teacher, well-liked, but her life ended tragically. The article said she died in the house, a suspected suicide after a long bout of depression. She was only 28. My skin crawled. Then came the cold spots. Not just the normal chills you get on a fall night, but pockets of icy cold that followed me around the house. The basement was the worst. It was unfinished, dark, and always smelled faintly of mildew. I rarely went down there, but I couldn't ignore the feeling of being watched. One evening, I had stayed late at work and arrived home after dark. The house was pitch black, except for the flicker of a candle burning in the living room. I hadn't lit any candles. I froze. Then the candle went out. I turned on the lights and everything seemed normal again. But the unease lingered. I checked all the windows and doors. They were locked tight. I started locking my bedroom door at night. One night, I woke to the sound of whispering. Low, urgent, a chorus of voices overlapping. I couldn't make out words, just a rising and falling murmur. I sat up, heart pounding, and reached for the flashlight on my nightstand. Suddenly, the room temperature plummeted. My breath came out in white clouds. The whispering stopped. I looked around but saw nothing. The next day, I called a medium recommended by a coworker. She came with a small kit of crystals and candles and asked me to tell her everything. When I finished, she nodded slowly. "This house holds pain," she said. "Lillian never left. Her spirit is trapped here, bound by sorrow. She's trying to reach you." I was skeptical, but also desperate for answers. The medium performed a brief cleansing ritual. She asked the spirit to come forward to speak through her. For a moment, the air thickened, and a soft voice whispered, "Cold. Alone. Help me." The medium's face went pale. She told me Lillian's death was more complicated than the papers said, that she was betrayed, hurt deeply by someone she trusted. That night, things escalated. I woke to find the bedroom door open. I always closed it. On the floor, near the window, was a small bouquet of wildflowers, white daisies and lavender. I didn't bring them in. For the next few weeks, I found more signs. A faint handprint on the bathroom mirror, scratches on the wooden floor near the stairs, the faint scent of perfume I didn't wear. The footsteps were louder, more frequent. I started sleeping with a knife beside my bed. One night, I was jolted awake by the sound of glass breaking downstairs. I ran down to find the living room in disarray, my favorite vase shattered, papers scattered. The air was thick with cold, and I could hear the faint sobbing of a woman. I called the police, but there was no sign of forced entry. The officer was polite, but unconvinced. "Old houses make noises," he said. "You might be stressed." I knew better. I reached out to Lillian, silently begging her to stop. I didn't want to live in fear. The whispering grew more desperate. Then the nightmares started. Every night, I dreamt of a dark figure standing at the foot of my bed. Sometimes it was Lillian, pale and sad. Other times a man with cold eyes, a cruel smile. The dreams bled into waking hours. I would catch glimpses of shadows moving just out of sight. One morning, I found a note on my kitchen table, written in shaky cursive. Find the truth, set me free. I had no idea who wrote it. I decided to investigate more deeply. I contacted the local historical society and requested any records on Lillian and the house. A woman named Marjorie helped me comb through old documents. We discovered that Lillian's fiancé, Thomas Grayson, had been involved in a scandal, embezzlement, fraud, and accusations of violence. He disappeared the same year Lillian died. Rumors suggested he had been abusive. That night, my nightmares turned violent. The figure of Thomas appeared, taunting and threatening. I woke screaming, clutching the knife. Determined, I returned to the medium, asking for a full seance. The medium warned me it could be dangerous, but agreed to help. We gathered in the living room. Candles flickered. The medium called out to the spirits, inviting them to speak. Suddenly the room chilled. The air thickened. A voice, loud and anguished, filled the space. Lillian, you're free now. The medium collapsed, exhausted but smiling. In the days that followed, the house grew quiet. The footsteps stopped. The cold spots vanished. The shadows receded. I slept without fear. But on my last night there, as I packed the final box, I heard a faint whisper in my ear. Thank you. I never went back. Sometimes I wonder if the house waits for the next soul to come in, to listen, to help, because some stories never end. Story the end. It was the summer of 2014 when I moved into the old Victorian house on Elm Street in a small town in Massachusetts. I had just accepted a teaching job at the local high school and was eager to start fresh after a rough breakup. The house was charming, but had clearly seen better days. Creaky floors, peeling wallpaper, and a scent of damp wood that clung to the air. The previous owners had lived there for decades, and according to the neighbors, the house had a long history, though no one was keen to share the details. They just said it was a bit unsettled. The first few nights were uneventful. I was too busy unpacking and setting up my classroom to pay much attention to the little noises. Doors creaking, the wind rattling windows, footsteps in the attic above. Old houses make noises. I told myself that over and over. But it started on the third night. I was lying in bed when I heard it. Soft, deliberate footsteps pacing above me in the attic. I live alone, so this wasn't normal. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was probably a raccoon or some other critter, but the pacing was rhythmic, too steady for an animal. The next day, I checked the attic. It was empty, save for old boxes and some dusty furniture. I shrugged it off, assuming the floorboards might be settling. But over the next week, the footsteps grew louder and more frequent, always between 1 and 3 a.m. like clockwork. Sometimes there were faint whispers, unintelligible but definitely human. I started sleeping with a baseball bat beside the bed. One night, about 2 weeks after moving in, the footsteps stopped. Instead, I heard soft tapping on the walls of my bedroom. It began as a faint knock, 3 quick taps, then a pause, then 3 more. I counted them. The pattern was consistent. After a few minutes, the tapping grew louder, like someone was trying to get my attention. I got out of bed and knocked back 3 times on the wall. The tapping stopped instantly. I told my closest friend, Michael, about it the next day. He laughed nervously, but he agreed to come over to check it out. That night, Michael arrived at 8 p.m. We sat in the living room drinking coffee and trying to rationalize what was happening. As midnight approached, the house grew colder. The temperature dropped noticeably, and I saw my breath mist in the air. At exactly 1:05 a.m., the footsteps started again, pacing across the attic above us. Michael's face went pale. I grabbed his hand, and we both sat frozen. Then a whisper came from the hallway. It was a woman's voice, low and broken. "Help me." Michael bolted upright. "Did you hear that?" he asked. I nodded, barely able to breathe. We decided to explore the attic, believing maybe someone had broken in or was squatting. I grabbed a flashlight, and Michael held a wrench from the kitchen. The stairs creaked loudly as we climbed. When we reached the attic, the temperature dropped again. The beam of the flashlight barely penetrated the dense darkness. Suddenly, the whisper came again, louder this time. "Help me." We shone the light around and saw nothing but cobwebs and old furniture. Then, The attic door slammed shut behind us. We both jumped and tried to open it, but it was stuck fast. I started banging on the door. After a few moments, it creaked open, and we rushed downstairs. The next day, I called the local historical society to ask about the house's history. The woman on the phone hesitated, but then said that in the early 1900s, a woman named Margaret Hall lived there. She was said to have died tragically after falling down the stairs in the house. Some say she was pushed, but the cause was never officially determined. Since then, several owners reported strange occurrences before eventually leaving. I told Michael what I found out. He looked grim. "Maybe she's still here," he said quietly. The next few nights were worse. Doors slammed by themselves. Lights flickered. I heard crying from the basement, even though no one ever went down there. One night, I woke up to find my bedroom window wide open, though I was sure I had locked it. One particularly bad night, I was woken by a cold breeze on my face. Sitting up, I saw a figure at the foot of my bed, a woman in a white dress, her face pale and blurry, eyes dark and hollow. I froze, unable to move or scream. She reached out a hand, and I felt a sudden chill that seemed to seep into my bones. Then she vanished. The next morning, I called a local priest to bless the house. He came that afternoon, sprinkled holy water around every room, and said prayers. He told me that sometimes spirits get stuck in places where their lives ended violently or abruptly. After the blessing, things seemed to calm down for a while. But then one night, Elias, the neighbor's 7-year-old boy, came over, frightened. He said he saw the woman by the window, watching him. I realized the spirit wasn't just haunting me, but others nearby. Determined to get answers, I contacted a paranormal investigator, an older man named Samuel. He came with equipment, EMF meters, infrared cameras, and voice recorders. We set up devices in the attic and basement and spent the night recording. At 2:33 a.m., the EMF meter spiked. The camera caught a shadow moving quickly across the hallway. On the voice recorder, a faint voice whispered, "Get out." Samuel told me that the spirit was restless, trapped in some form of pain or rage. The final incident happened 3 weeks later. I was downstairs when the house suddenly shook, like a small earthquake. Pictures fell from walls. Doors banged open and shut violently. I ran upstairs and found the attic door wide open, despite being locked earlier. Inside, the temperature was freezing. I saw the woman again, standing in the corner, her face distorted in anguish. She screamed, a soundless scream that rattled my soul. I ran out and never returned. I sold the house within the month. The new owners moved in, but left after 6 months, refusing to speak about their experience. Sometimes late at night, I still hear footsteps outside my apartment, and a faint whisper trails on the wind. I wonder if Margaret Hall is still searching for peace, or if she's waiting for someone else to listen to her story. Story the end. The house I moved into wasn't old by typical haunted house standards, but it had a history, one I wasn't aware of when I signed the lease. It was built in the late 70s, a plain 2-story in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of Cleveland. I was 27, freshly divorced, and wanted a fresh start. The rent was reasonable, the landlord was easy to work with, and the place felt like a good deal. The first few weeks were normal enough. I settled in, unpacked boxes, and went about my days working from home. It was quiet, sometimes too quiet, but that wasn't unusual. What was unusual started the night I heard the footsteps. I was lying in bed around midnight when I heard it. A slow, heavy pacing across the floor above me. The footsteps were deliberate, slow, and rhythmic, like someone was walking with purpose. But I lived alone. The house was a single-family detached with a finished attic space that I used for storage. No tenants, no roommates, no visitors. I told myself it was the old floorboards creaking or maybe the pipes settling, but over the next few nights the footsteps returned, always starting at the same time, around midnight, and lasting for about 10 minutes before fading away. One night, the footsteps stopped, replaced by a low humming. It was faint but distinct, like a lullaby. I sat up in bed and listened. It sent chills down my spine. I turned on the bedside lamp, but the humming stopped immediately. I started keeping a journal, noting down when the sounds happened, hoping to find a pattern. It seemed to be every third night around midnight. One evening, I invited a friend over, Anna, who was skeptical about all things paranormal. We stayed up late talking, and as the clock approached midnight, I told her to listen for the footsteps. When they started, slow and steady, Anna's eyes widened. When the humming began, she grabbed my arm and whispered, "This is creepy." After that night, Anna convinced me to research the house's history. I went to the local library and dug through public records and old newspapers. I found that the house was built on land that had once been a small farmstead dating back to the early 1900s. The farm had been owned by a family named the Matthews. According to an article from 1932, the Matthews' young daughter, Evelyn, had died suddenly of pneumonia in the house, which stood on the exact same plot of land. The article described Evelyn as a quiet, sweet child who loved to sing lullabies to herself. The family had moved away shortly after her death. I started to connect the dots, the lullaby humming, the footsteps that might belong to a child. The first direct encounter happened about 2 weeks later. I was in the kitchen preparing dinner when I heard a soft, giggling noise from the hallway. I called out, "Hello?" but no answer. The air felt colder than usual. As I moved toward the hallway, I saw a small shadow dart across the wall, too quick to be a person. I followed it into the living room where the feeling of cold intensified. My breath formed little clouds in the air. On the floor near the fireplace lay an old, faded doll I hadn't seen before. It looked like something from a different era, porcelain face chipped and one eye missing. I picked it up carefully and inspected it. At that moment, I felt a cold hand touch my shoulder. I spun around, but no one was there. My heart pounded. I decided to research dolls from the 1920s and 30s and showed a photo of it to a local antiques expert. She confirmed it was indeed from the early 1900s, likely a child's favorite toy. The strange activity escalated after that. Objects moved on their own, kitchen knives disappearing and then found in the bedroom, cabinets opening when no one was near, the sound of a music box playing faintly at night. The most terrifying night happened 2 months after I moved in. I was asleep when I woke to the sensation of someone or something sitting on the edge of my bed. I opened my eyes to see a pale figure of a little girl with long hair and a white nightgown. Her eyes were sad but pleading. She whispered, "Play with me." Frozen with fear, I tried to speak, but no words came out. She reached out a tiny hand and touched my cheek. I felt an icy coldness spread through my skin. Then she disappeared. I never slept in my bedroom again. I started sleeping in the living room couch, but the occurrences didn't stop. I could still hear the footsteps at midnight, the lullaby humming, the occasional soft giggle. I contacted a local paranormal investigator, someone recommended by a friend. He came with his equipment, EMF detectors, infrared cameras, and audio recorders. He spent 2 nights in the house. On the first night, his EMF detector went off near the attic entrance, high spikes of electromagnetic activity. On the second night, his audio recorder picked up a faint voice whispering, "Evelyn." He told me the house was indeed haunted by the spirit of a child, restless and lonely. He suggested a blessing to help ease the spirit, which I agreed to. The day after the blessing, the house felt lighter. The cold spots vanished, the footsteps stopped, but the lullaby humming continued for a few weeks more before finally fading into silence. It's been 5 years since I lived there. I moved out when the rent was raised and found a place with no history, no whispers in the dark. But sometimes, when the wind is just right and I'm alone, I find myself humming a lullaby that I never learned. Story the end. The first time I heard about the house on Maple Street was years before I ever saw it. I grew up in a small town in New England where stories about old houses and ghosts weren't just told around campfires, they were a part of the town's history. The house itself was almost a legend, whispered about among the locals, especially the kids daring each other to step inside after dark. It was the kind of place that had that peeling paint, sagging porch look, surrounded by overgrown trees and thick ivy that seemed to choke the life out of it. When I finally moved back to town after college, I found myself living just a few blocks away. The house was empty, a weathered giant watching over the neighborhood. Most people avoided it, and the real estate agent had been trying for months to sell it with no luck. Something about it felt wrong, but no one could quite say why. The rumors ranged from a family tragedy to strange happenings at night. Some swore they'd heard cries or seen shadows move in the windows. My friend Anna and I were fascinated by it. She was the brave one, always pushing me to explore the unknown, and I was the skeptic, wanting proof but not quite ready to admit the stories might be true. One weekend, fueled by boredom and curiosity, we decided to check it out. It was a chilly October evening, the kind where the air smelled like smoke from burning leaves and the sky was a thick gray. The sun had just dipped below the horizon when we crept through the rusted gate, careful not to make noise. The house was bigger than I'd expected, 2 stories, with tall, narrow windows and a porch swing that creaked in the wind. The front door was cracked open a bit, as if inviting us in. We stepped inside. The air was stale, heavy with dust and something else, an old, sour smell I couldn't place. The floorboards groaned under our feet, and the faint light from our phones barely pierced the shadows. Paint peeled from the walls in large flakes, and cobwebs stretched from the ceiling corners like silent witnesses. Anna pulled out a small flashlight. "Let's check upstairs," she whispered. I nodded, swallowing a nervous lump in my throat. The stairs were steep and narrow, and with each creak I expected something to jump out at us. At the top, the hallway was lined with doors, most hanging slightly off their hinges. We tried a few, but they opened into empty rooms filled with the remnants of a long-forgotten life. Old furniture draped in sheets, cracked picture frames, and torn curtains that fluttered in the draft. Then we heard it. A faint sound, like footsteps. We froze. It was soft, slow, deliberate, coming from the end of the hall. "Did you hear that?" Anna asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded. We edged toward the source. At the very end of the hall, there was a door slightly ajar. The footsteps seemed to be coming from inside. Anna pushed the door open fully. The room was dark except for a small, round mirror hanging crooked on the far wall. The glass was fogged and cracked. Then, in the reflection, I saw it, a figure standing behind us. Pale, blurred, with no distinct features. It was like looking at a shadow trapped under a veil. I spun around, but there was nothing there. My heart was pounding. I grabbed Anna's arm. "Let's go." We hurried down the stairs and out of the house, the cold air hitting our faces like a splash of water. Neither of us spoke on the way back to her car. Over the next few weeks, I couldn't stop thinking about that night. I did some digging and learned the house had belonged to the Marlowe family. They'd moved in during the 1920s, and the mother, Clara Marlowe, had lost her 2 children to illness within a year of moving in. She died alone in the house a few years later, supposedly of a broken heart. Some said the children's spirits never left. One night, driven by a mix of fear and fascination, I decided to go back, alone this time. I brought a small recorder, hoping to capture something unexplained. The house was eerily quiet. I walked through the same rooms, trying to keep calm. At exactly midnight, the air changed. It felt colder, heavier. I heard the footsteps again, soft, pacing back and forth just outside the door at the end of the hall. I held my breath and waited. Then the door slowly creaked open by itself. I stepped back, heart in my throat, and the room filled with a faint whispering. The voice was a child's, soft, pleading. "Stay with us." The recorder in my hand beeped suddenly as the batteries died. I ran from the house that night and didn't stop until I was back in my apartment, safe and locked inside. Days later, I listened to the tape, hoping to hear the whisper again. At first, it was just static, but then, beneath the hiss, I heard it clearly. "Stay with us. I haven't been back since." Story, the end. The house had been in my family for generations, sitting on the outskirts of a small town in Maine. It was a sprawling, creaky Victorian with peeling paint, a wraparound porch, and windows that seemed to stare like empty eyes. Growing up, I always heard whispers about the place. Strange noises, doors opening on their own, shadows in the corners. But I never believed in ghosts or anything supernatural. To me, it was just an old house with a lot of history and a little too much wear and tear. After college, I decided to move back to take care of the house. My parents were aging, and the thought of the property falling into disrepair made me uneasy. I figured living there alone would be peaceful, maybe even inspiring for the novel I was working on. But from the moment I arrived, something felt off. The first few nights were quiet, except for the usual creaks and groans you'd expect from a 100-year-old house. I told myself it was just the wind or the house settling. But then I started hearing footsteps on the floor above me when I was downstairs, even though I lived alone and the attic was sealed tight. It wasn't the soft shuffle of someone walking carefully. It was deliberate and heavy. At first, I thought it might be animals, raccoons or squirrels trapped in the attic, but the sound was distinctly human. One night, I was sitting in the living room working on my laptop when the hallway light flickered on and off by itself. I got up and flipped the breaker switch, thinking it was an electrical issue. But as I walked back toward the kitchen, I saw the old wooden rocking chair on the porch moving, just slightly, like it was being rocked by an invisible hand. The air felt colder, and I shivered even though it was summer. I went outside to check for pranksters or a gust of wind. The chair stopped moving the moment I stepped onto the porch. There was no one around, no wind, just the empty street and the distant sound of crickets. I felt uneasy, but brushed it off as my imagination. The next day, I asked my elderly neighbor, Mrs. Grayson, about the house. She had lived nearby all her life and knew a lot about its history. When I mentioned the strange occurrences, she looked at me with a serious expression. "That house has always been troubled," she said quietly. "The original owner, a man named Harold Green, lost his wife and child there under tragic circumstances. Some say their spirits never left." Curious, I started researching Harold Green. According to old newspaper archives, Harold's wife died in childbirth in the house in 1912. The baby survived, but Harold's grief consumed him. A few months later, the baby vanished without a trace. No one ever found the child. Harold was said to have gone mad, locking himself in the attic until his death years later. The attic was sealed when I moved in, but now I felt compelled to explore it. I found the old key hidden under a loose floorboard in the upstairs hallway. My heart pounded as I turned the rusted lock and pulled open the creaking door. The attic was dusty and dark, filled with old furniture draped in sheets and boxes of forgotten belongings. But there was something else. Faint, small footprints in the dust leading to the far corner of the room where a tiny, weathered crib sat covered in cobwebs. I reached out to touch the crib, and the air suddenly turned freezing cold. My breath fogged in front of me. Then, from the darkness, I heard a soft, sorrowful lullaby humming. I spun around, shining my flashlight, but there was nothing there. Over the following weeks, the haunting escalated. Doors slammed shut when I wasn't near them. I found objects moved from where I left them. My keys on the kitchen table one moment, then on the living room floor the next. The whispers grew louder, soft cries that seemed to echo from the walls. Sometimes, late at night, I'd see a pale figure standing at the foot of my bed, a woman in a tattered white dress with hollow eyes and long dark hair covering her face. I tried to rationalize everything. Maybe it was stress, loneliness, or sleep deprivation. But then came the night I couldn't ignore the terror anymore. I woke up around 3 a.m. to the sound of a baby crying. The sound was desperate and raw, coming from the attic. My blood ran cold. I tried to convince myself it was a nightmare, but the crying persisted, growing louder and more frantic. I grabbed my flashlight and hesitantly climbed the stairs. The attic door was slightly ajar, the same cold air spilling out. I pushed it open and swept my light across the room. The crib was empty, but the crying was right behind me. I turned slowly to see a shadowy figure standing in the corner, a woman, transparent and trembling, holding an invisible child. Her lips moved in a silent plea, her eyes filled with anguish. Then she reached out toward me, her fingers passing through the air like mist, like mist. I stumbled back, heart pounding. The crying stopped abruptly, replaced by a suffocating silence. I slammed the attic door shut and locked it, but the presence didn't leave. For nights after, I'd hear the lullaby, the soft sobbing, and see fleeting shadows in my peripheral vision. Desperate, I reached out to a local medium who specialized in restless spirits. She came to the house one evening, walked silently through the rooms, and then told me something chilling. This woman is trapped between worlds, caught by grief and loss. She's looking for her child, but the child is gone, lost to something darker. The house holds their pain like a wound. The medium performed a ritual, asking the spirits to find peace. As she finished, a sudden gust of wind swept through the house, knocking over a candle. For a moment, I thought the air lifted, that the house was breathing easier. But that night, the cries returned louder than ever. I realized the truth was harsher than I wanted to accept. The woman, Harold Green's wife, was not alone. There was something else, something malevolent, keeping the child, or what was left of it, trapped. One night I dreamt I followed a small child through a labyrinth of dark hallways and locked doors. The child's face was obscured, but the crying was constant. When I finally reached the end, I found a small room with peeling wallpaper and an old cradle. The child lay inside, but its body was twisted, pale as death, eyes wide open and black as coal. A shadow loomed behind the child, a figure darker than the night, whispering promises no one should hear. I jolted awake, heart racing, drenched in sweat. The room was freezing, and I heard a faint whisper, "Find her. Set her free." I knew then I had to confront the darkness, or it would consume me too. I spent days researching occult practices, old town records, anything to understand what I was dealing with. The local library revealed stories of a ritual performed by Harold Green, desperate to save his family from death. He sought forbidden knowledge to bind the spirits, but something went wrong. Armed with this knowledge, I returned to the house on a stormy night. I lit candles and placed protective symbols around the attic. Chanting the prayers I'd learned, I begged the spirits to release their hold. As I spoke, the room grew icy, and the shadows coalesced into figures, first the woman, then the child, and finally the dark presence. The malevolent force screamed, a sound that ripped through the air, and for a moment I thought it would tear the house apart. But then a brilliant light filled the attic. The woman's face softened, the child's form became clearer, and the dark shadow recoiled. With a final cry, the darkness vanished, leaving only silence and warmth behind. The spirits were free. Since that night, the house has been calm. The footsteps stopped, the whispers vanished. The air feels lighter, and I can finally sleep without fear. But sometimes, when the wind is just right, I hear a soft lullaby drifting through the rooms, a reminder of the sorrow that once haunted this place, and the love that never died. Story the end.